I stood there in the middle of the room, clutching the torn fragments of an old photograph of the Virgin Mary when my 5-year-old son simply vanished. He didn't run off. He didn't hide behind the couch as he always did when I lost my patience. He was gone, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole, and in that moment, with the shards of glass from the frame scattered across the floor and the yellowed paper of the sacred image trembling in my hands, I knew I had crossed a line I should never have crossed. My name is John Carter. I'm 42 years old, and for a long time I believed that faith was just a pretty word people used to comfort themselves. I lived with my wife Claire and our son Michael in a small town called Oak Haven, where everyone knows everyone else and traditions are passed down from father to son like a mandatory inheritance. It was a simple life. I worked as a mechanic in my father-in-law's shop, and on Sundays the whole family gathered at home for those interminable lunches where the elders always had a story to tell or some advice to give. The photograph of the Virgin Mary had always been there, on the makeshift altar in our living room. It was a family heirloom from Claire's side, passed down through generations, with its slightly chipped golden frame and glass that reflected the light in a way that always bothered me. Claire said the image protected our home, our family, and that as long as it was there, nothing bad could happen to us. I always shrugged off these things. Religion to me was something for people who needed emotional crutches. I was a practical man. I believed in what I could see and touch, but that Sunday in March, something inside me exploded. Maybe it was the stifling heat. Maybe it was the way my mother-in-law kept giving me the side eye when I said I wasn't going to Mass, or maybe it was just years of being treated like an outsider in my own home for not sharing the family's beliefs. Claire had just served dessert when she started another conversation about the importance of faith, about how I should be a better example for Michael, about how my attitude was keeping God's blessings away from our family. Blessings. I exploded, pushing myself away from the table so hard that the chair almost fell over. What blessings? I work like a dog 6 days a week to barely make ends meet. You're constantly nagging me to be more religious, and I still have to hear that it's all my fault for not praying to a piece of old paper. The silence that fell over the room was heavy as lead. Claire looked at me with tears in her eyes. Michael was playing with his toy cars on the floor without understanding what was happening, and I felt the weight of everyone's judgment. That's when my gaze fell on the damned photograph. It seemed to stare back at me with those serene and compassionate eyes that I always interpreted as condescending. "You know what?" I said, walking toward the altar. "Let's test all this protection." Before anyone could react, I grabbed the frame with both hands. Claire screamed my name, tried to get up from her chair, but I was already consumed by a rage I didn't even fully understand. With a sharp movement, I raised the photograph above my head and in front of everyone, tore the image of the Virgin Mary in half. The sound was terrible, not just the paper tearing, but the glass of the frame shattering, the shards falling to the floor, and underneath it all a silence so profound it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was as if time had stopped. Claire was frozen, one hand over her chest, her eyes wide with horror. My mother-in-law was clutching her rosary so hard that her knuckles were white, and Michael was right next to me, looking at the pieces of the photograph with that innocent curiosity of children. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't like him sneaking out of the room. It was instantaneous. 1 second he was there, the next second the space beside me was empty, as if he had never existed. But I could feel the warmth his body had left in the air. I could hear the echo of the last giggle he had given seconds before. "Michael," I called out, still holding the torn pieces of the photograph. "Michael, where are you?" It was Claire who recovered from the shock first. She got up so fast that she knocked over her glass of juice, which shattered on the floor, along with the shards of glass from the frame. "Michael, Michael," she began to scream, running through the rooms of the house. "John Carter, what did you do? What did you do to our son?" The accusation in her voice hit me like a punch to the stomach. I dropped the pieces of the photograph and ran after her, searching every corner of the house. Under the beds, inside the closets, in the backyard, in the bathroom, in the kitchen. Nothing. Michael had simply vanished. The family joined the search, and soon half the neighborhood was on our street, looking for a 5-year-old boy that no one had seen leave the house. The police were called, neighbors brought flashlights, and as night fell, I felt despair growing inside my chest like a poisonous plant. But what tormented me most wasn't just Michael's disappearance. It was how it happened. It was the strange feeling that his vanishing was connected to what I had done. Every time someone asked what had happened before the boy disappeared, I felt a crushing weight on my chest. How could I explain that I had torn a sacred picture right in front of my son, and that seconds later he had vanished into thin air? Claire could barely look at me. She coordinated the searches with a frightening determination, as if every second lost was my fault. And maybe it was. My mother-in-law didn't even try to hide the hatred in her gaze. "You caused this," she whispered to me when no one was listening. "You disrespected the sacred, and now you're paying the price." On the first night without Michael, I couldn't sleep a minute. I kept pacing the house, revisiting every corner where he might be hiding, as if on the 10th or 20th search I would find something I had overlooked before. The house felt different. It wasn't just Michael's absence I felt, it was as if something larger had broken there. The air was heavy, charged with a tension I couldn't name. It was on the second night that I started hearing the sounds. They were faint whispers, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the living room, where I had torn the photograph. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe the pipes in the old house. But as I paid closer attention, I realized there was a pattern to the whispers. It was as if someone were praying, or singing a lullaby very softly. "Claire, do you hear that?" I asked my wife, who was lying beside me in bed, stiff as a board. "Hear what?" she replied, without turning to me. "Those whispers, it sounds like it's coming from the living room." She was silent for a long time, so long that I thought she had fallen asleep. But then she sighed deeply and said, "I hear many things, John. I hear my son calling for me from somewhere I can't reach. I hear my own faith being tested in a way I never imagined it would be. And I also hear my mother saying that maybe you were right about one thing." "About what?" "About there being no protection, because if there were, my son would be here." Those words cut me deeper than any direct accusation could have. Claire was losing her faith, and somehow I knew that was worse than losing Michael, because without faith, how would she have the strength to keep searching? I got out of bed and went to the living room. Moonlight streamed through the windows and illuminated the spot where the altar used to be. The broken glass had been swept away, but the torn pieces of the photograph were still there, on the small table, like evidence of my crime. I picked up the two pieces and tried to fit them together, as if by reassembling the image I could undo everything that had happened. That's when I noticed something strange. Along the tear line, where the paper had split, there were tiny points of light. No, they weren't points of light. They were like tiny holes, so minuscule that they were only visible when the moonlight passed through them. And these tiny holes formed a pattern. It looked almost like stars, like a constellation. "This is impossible," I muttered to myself. "Paper doesn't develop holes on its own, especially not in perfect geometric patterns." But there they were, tiny points of light forming a figure I couldn't quite identify. Carrying the pieces of the photograph, I went out to the backyard. The morning air was cool, a blessing after the day's heat. I held the pieces of the image towards the full moon, and the tiny points of light became more visible. Now I could clearly see that they formed the silhouette of a child with outstretched arms, as if being carried or protected by something larger. My heart pounded. Could it be a sign? Was it possible that I was going crazy from despair and seeing things that weren't there? I went back inside and got a magnifying glass I used to examine small parts in the workshop. Under magnification, the tiny holes became even sharper. There was no doubt they perfectly formed the silhouette of a child. "Claire," I called, running to the bedroom. "Claire, come see this." She got up reluctantly, following me to the living room, with her eyes still swollen from crying. When I showed her the tiny holes in the torn photograph, she was silent for a long time, turning the pieces of paper against the light. "What do you think this means?" I asked. She handed me back the pieces of the photograph and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger, nor sadness. It was something like determination. "It means you're going to have to learn to believe in things you can't explain," she said, "because if we want to find our son, we're going to need more than logic and skepticism." And that's how the strangest part of this whole story began. Claire convinced me to seek help from people who understood spiritual things. It wasn't easy for me, a man who had always scoffed at such things, to admit that there might be forces in the world that I didn't understand. But despair has a way of breaking down even the most deeply rooted prejudices. The first person we sought out was Mrs. Benedita, a nearly 80-year-old woman who lived on the outskirts of town and was reputed to understand things beyond. She received us in a simple little house, full of saints and candles, where the smell of incense permeated every corner. When I showed her the torn pieces of the photograph, Mrs. Benedict was silent for a long time, her wrinkled fingers tracing the paper and murmuring prayers softly. Finally, she looked up at me and said something that sent chills down my spine. "My son, you didn't just tear a photograph, you broke a pact your family has kept for generations, and when a spiritual pact is broken like this, there are always consequences." "What pact?" I asked, a cold dread gripping my stomach. "Your mother-in-law never told you the story of this picture, where it came from, why it's so important to the family." Claire and I exchanged glances. My mother-in-law always said the photograph was special, that it protected the family, but she'd never gone into detail about its origin. "You need to talk to her," Mrs. Benedict continued. "You need to discover the truth about this image, because until the pact is restored the right way, your son will remain lost between two worlds." "Two worlds?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "The world of the living and the world of the guardian spirits. When you broke the image," she said, pointing at me, "you opened a door, and your son was taken to the other side of that door." We left Mrs. Benedict's house, with more questions than answers, but at least we now had a direction. Claire confronted her mother that very night, demanding to know the whole truth about the photograph of the Virgin Mary. At first her mother resisted. She said they were old stories, that they didn't matter anymore. But when Claire threatened to cut ties with her if she didn't tell the truth, the old woman finally gave in. The story she told changed everything I thought about that picture and my wife's family. According to my mother-in-law, the photograph wasn't just a religious keepsake. It had been blessed by a special priest in the 19th century, during an epidemic that nearly wiped out the region where Oakhaven now stands. Clara's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Mary of Sorrows, had made a solemn vow before this image, in exchange for the protection of her family against the disease. She promised that the image would be preserved and honored by all future generations. "And it worked," explained my mother-in-law, her eyes glistening with tears. "Our family never suffered great tragedies. We never lost children to disease, never went through extreme hardship, never faced the misfortunes that plagued other families in the region, all because we kept our commitment to the Virgin." "But that's just superstition," I protested, even knowing my skepticism sounded hollow after everything that had happened. "Is it?" my mother-in-law challenged me. "Then explain to me where my grandson is. Explain to me why he disappeared exactly the moment you destroyed the image. Explain those little holes that appeared in the torn paper." I had no explanation, and as the days passed without news of Michael, I was beginning to realize that I needed to accept that there might be things in the world that my rational mind couldn't process. It was Claire who suggested we return to Mrs. Benedict with this information. The old woman listened attentively, and then did something that left me even more disconcerted. She laughed. "You think it's just a matter of gluing the photograph back together, and that's it, everything's solved," she said, shaking her head. It doesn't work that way, my children. The vow was broken with anger, with disrespect. To restore it, it takes more than glue and good intentions. What does it take? Claire asked. It takes true faith, and not inherited faith. Not faith out of fear or tradition. You need to develop a personal, genuine faith, based on love and not on fear. She looked directly at me. Especially you, John, because it was your lack of faith that caused all this, and only your true faith can undo it. But I don't know how to have faith, I admitted, feeling as small as a child. I always thought these things were nonsense. Faith isn't something you think, my son. It's something you feel, and the love you have for your boy, that's already the beginning of true faith. Miss Benedict gave us specific instructions. We needed to make a pilgrimage to an abandoned chapel high in the mountains, about 10 miles from town. There, she said, was an original altar where the first miraculous image had been consecrated. If we made the journey with sincere faith, carrying the torn pieces of the photograph, perhaps we could restore the pact and bring Michael back. But how do we know he's okay? I asked. My voice choked. How do we know he's not suffering, scared, or, because the guardian spirit doesn't hurt children? Mrs. Benedict interrupted me. It takes them to protect them when the pact is broken. Your son is safe, but he's waiting for you to do the right thing. The walk to the abandoned chapel was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. Not only physically, the path was steep and full of loose rocks, but emotionally, with every step, I felt confronted with questions I had avoided my whole life. What did it really mean to have faith? Was it possible to believe in something greater than ourselves without abandoning reason? What if I was wrong about everything? Claire walked beside me in silence, carrying the pieces of the photograph in a small cloth bag that had belonged to her grandmother. Periodically, she would stop to rest and look at the distant mountains, as if searching for some sign, some clue as to where our son might be. It was during one of these stops that something extraordinary happened. We were resting under a large tree, drinking water and trying to catch our breath, when we heard a child's laughter echoing through the hills, a laughter I would recognize anywhere in the world. Michael, I shouted, leaping to my feet and scanning the surroundings. Michael, where are you? Laughter echoed again, closer this time, but its source remained invisible. It was as if carried on the wind, emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. He's following us, Claire said, her eyes shining with a flicker of hope for the first time in days. He knows we're coming for him. We continued our trek with renewed energy. As we approached the chapel, more signs appeared, small footprints in the earth, the exact size of Michael's feet, wildflowers, trampled in the clumsy way he always did, and always that distant laughter, guiding us uphill. The chapel, when we finally found it, was smaller than I expected, old, its walls covered in moss, the roof partially collapsed, yet it held a certain majesty, something that made you instinctively lower your voice and remove your hat. Inside, a simple stone altar, unadorned, except for an empty frame in the center. It's here, Claire whispered, taking the torn pieces of the photograph from her purse. This is where we need to restore the image. But as she tried to fit the torn pieces into the empty frame, something strange happened. They didn't fit. It was as if the frame was slightly misshapen, or as if the pieces of the photograph had changed size. It's not working, she said, her voice trembling with despair. Why isn't it working? That's when I understood. It wasn't about gluing the pieces back together. It was about understanding why I had torn the picture in the first place. It was about finding a faith that wasn't based on fear or tradition, but on true love. I knelt before the altar, and for the first time in my adult life, truly prayed. I didn't recite memorized prayers, or repeat formulas someone had taught me. I spoke to God, or the universe, or whatever higher power was listening, from the bottom of my heart. I don't know if you exist, I began, feeling tears streaming down my face. But if you do, please forgive me. I tore that picture not because I doubted you, but because I was afraid to believe, and be disappointed. I was afraid to surrender my heart to something I couldn't control or understand. But now I understand that loving my son, loving my wife, wanting to protect and care for them, that's already a form of faith. That's already believing in something bigger than myself. As I spoke, a strange peace washed over me, a feeling that I wasn't alone there, that benevolent presences were listening and understanding. Please, I continued, give me back my son, and teach me to be the father he deserves, a father who can balance reason and faith, skepticism and hope, a father who isn't afraid to admit that there are mysteries in the world worth preserving. When I opened my eyes, the torn pieces of the photograph were glowing with a soft light, not an artificial light, but something subtler, as if the paper itself was radiating warmth. Claire took my hand, and together we placed the pieces in the empty frame. This time, they fit perfectly, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Michael came running between the chapel ruins, laughing and skipping, as if he'd just received the best birthday present ever. "Daddy, Mommy," he shouted, leaping into our arms, "you came for me. I knew you would." I hugged my son so tightly, I was afraid of hurting him, but he only laughed louder, as if our reunion was the most natural thing in the world. "Where were you, my love?" Claire asked, showering his face with kisses. "Were you scared?" "No, Mommy," Michael replied with that funny seriousness children have. "I was with the nice lady. She took care of me, and said you were going to learn something important, and then you'd come get me." "What nice lady?" I asked. Michael pointed to the frame on the altar, where the torn pieces of the photograph now formed a complete new image. It was no longer the yellowed, old photograph of Claire's grandmother. It was a vivid, luminous image that seemed to look at me with compassion and understanding. She said, "Now you know that loving is a way of praying," Michael continued, as if repeating words he had memorized, "and that praying is a way of loving, and that when we truly love we're never alone." We returned home at dusk, with Michael playing between us as if nothing had happened. But I knew everything had changed, not only because my son had returned, but because I had discovered something about myself I never knew existed. Faith, I discovered, isn't the opposite of reason, it's a complement to it. It's the ability to accept that there are mysteries in the world worth preserving, people worth loving unconditionally, and forces greater than ourselves that work through our love and dedication. Today, 3 years later, I still keep that image on the altar in our living room, but now it's different. It's not an object of blind veneration or forced tradition. It's a daily reminder that true love, whether for our family or something greater than ourselves, is the most powerful force in the world. And if you're watching this story, if you're going through a difficult time in your life, I want you to know that sometimes we lose the most important things to learn to truly appreciate them. Sometimes we need to tear certain images to discover truer ones beneath, and sometimes we need to admit we don't know everything to begin learning the things that truly matter. I can't scientifically explain what happened to us those days. I can't prove my son was taken by a guardian spirit, or that sincere faith can restore broken spiritual pacts. What I can say is that when we stopped fighting against life's mysteries and started embracing them with love, extraordinary things can happen. Michael is 8 now, and still talks about the nice lady sometimes, especially when he's praying before bed. Claire started going back to church, but now with a more mature faith, less based on fear and more on love. And I learned that being a skeptic doesn't mean denying everything we can't explain. It means keeping an open mind to possibilities that might be beyond our current understanding. The workshop is still running, I still work with my hands, and I still believe in the importance of logic and reason. But now I also know that there are other forms of knowledge, other ways to connect with the world and the people we love. And when my customers come to chat while they wait for their cars to be ready, sometimes I tell them this story, not to convince them of anything,
but to remind them that we all at some point in life need to learn to balance our need to understand everything with our capacity to love unconditionally. If you've made it this far in this account, it's because something inside you recognizes the truth of these words. Maybe you're also going through a time where you need to choose between closing your heart to protect yourself or opening it to connect. Maybe you're also discovering that the most important things in life can't be measured or explained, only lived and shared. And if that's the case, I want to leave you with the words Michael said to me that afternoon as we were returning from the chapel. Dad, the nice lady said that when you truly love, you're never alone. No matter how lost you feel, no matter how many images you've torn up in your life, there's always a way back home. There's always a chance to restore what was broken and to find a faith that's genuinely your own. Because in the end, maybe true faith isn't about believing in impossible things. Maybe it's about having the courage to love deeply in a world that doesn't always make sense, and to trust that this love, in some mysterious and beautiful way, will always lead us back to where we need to be.